In this video, I'm going to show you how you rack from a carboy into a keg. First thing I need to do is get my carboy out of my chest freezer here where it's been fermenting. So when you're lifting a carboy out of the freezer, you've got to be very careful. I always put one hand underneath the carboy to lift most of the weight and another hand on the top to steady it. Alright, so I've got pretty much everything set up here. I've got my carboy out of the freezer and I've set it on a towel. I'll show you why later. I've also got my sanitizer bucket down here, also on a towel with my keg, my empty keg that's going to get filled. Got a large funnel, an auto siphon, some gloves, and some transfer tubing. There are 3 elements to a successful racking. Number 1, we want to sanitize everything and make sure it's clean. Number 2, we want as little oxygen pickup as possible. And number 3, we want to keep as much of our beer as we possibly can, without ruining it with a bunch of trub. There's nothing wrong with sanitizer touching your hands, but I find that my hands get really dry if I spend a lot of time in there. So, I like to wear gloves. You don't have to, but I like to do it because I like to keep my hands nice and soft. First step here is to sanitize the keg. So I'm going to take my funnel, put that on the keg right here, pick up my bucket, I put the lid back on the keg with sanitizer in there. I want every piece of the inside of this keg, every square millimeter, to have sanitizer touch it. Pull the lid off. So a little tip for you boys and girls, when you go to dump a keg out, go very slow because it's going to lunge forward and it's going to come out of there before you're really ready for it to come out. And now I'm just going to drain it. Alright, we've got our keg sanitized now. Now it's time to sanitize our transfer tubing and our auto siphon. There's always more than one way to skin a cat, but I'm going to show you how I do it. I take the auto siphon like this so that it's apart, and I drop those sides in because I want the top of this to get sanitized because it doesn't fit all the way down in my bucket. And this, I want the bottom of it to get sanitized. So I drop them in there, and they're wet, they're sanitized. Now I put it together, like so. I take the tubing and I dunk it. And this is mostly a dunk to make sure the outside of the tube, all of the outside of the tube is sanitized. Because this tube is going to be inside of my keg while it's filling, so I even need the outside of the tube to be clean. Do a quick dip of the cane to make sure it's wet, and I put the tube inside. Once it's on there, now I actually run the auto siphon with sanitizer through the tube. Make sure the inside of the tube is all sanitized. I lift it out. Now, one thing that always gets me is this little red cap that is a little blocker for the auto siphon. It always holds a little sanitizer in there. So remember that when you go to put it inside your carboy, because if you tip this up right now, all that sanitizer just came out of the cap. So usually, this is why I have a towel down, I turn it upside down, let all that sanitizer get out. A little bit of sanitizer is not going to hurt your beer. A lot of sanitizer, you just don't want it in your beer. You want beer, not Star San, right? So dump it all out, gently take the tube, let it kind of drip off some of that extra Star San and that foam. Don't fear the foam, but there's no reason to flirt with the foam either. So I take this, drop that in my keg so that it's not squirming around. There are a couple of schools of thought on how to rack and minimize the amount of trub uptake. One of them says to only put the auto siphon in about this far, and then as the level of beer goes down, you slowly lower it down to the bottom to prevent pickup from the yeast cake or any other materials that have dropped out during fermentation or crashing. The other method, which is the one that I use, is I jam it all the way down in there because my stopper is a good inch above where the intake is. So it usually doesn't penetrate all the way through the cake and allow anything in, and it saves me a lot of hassle about dropping it as it goes down with the level. And then I take the auto siphon, and as gently as possible, I drop it all the way in, as far down as it'll go. There, it's at the bottom, all the way down, and I'm pointing it to an angle. I'm trying to get it as close to this corner as possible because towards the end, I'm gonna tilt the carboy just a little to get the beer to run to that side. So from here, all I do is I take one long stroke and pump. And you can see there's almost no uptake of any sediment. Even from the first pump, it looks crystal clear coming through here. Now, while you're transferring, it's important to minimize oxygen by keeping the end of the tube underneath the level of beer. So that way, all the beer getting sucked up from the bottom is not touching any oxygen because it's on the bottom, and all the beer going into the keg is going into a non-oxygen environment. Some people like to purge their kegs with CO2, and that's even better. Now is a good time to take a final gravity reading because I'm getting close to the end. There's not a lot of distance left here. The tube is still underneath the level of beer, but I'm gonna have to kill that in a moment because I'm going to need to get some to take a sample. So I just run the end of the tube into my sample jar. And then I get the tube back under the level of beer. Now that we're getting really close to the end of the auto siphon, I'm going to tip the carboy just slightly in the direction of the corner where the auto siphon is. Now this is why I have a towel here. The towel prevents the carboy from sliding on a slick surface because it gives it some traction. It also has a little bit of padding, so it's a little bit easier to pull it without shaking the carboy. This is a cool little trick. You can roll the other end of the towel up so that you don't have to hold it. At this point, what you're looking for is one of two things. You're either looking for your keg to be overfilling or for tube to start coming up your line. Either one, and it's time to lift up the auto siphon, and that stops the transfer. But as soon as I hear that gargling, there it is. I can lift up the tube. Auto siphon is stopped. I'm gonna run out whatever's left in the hose, and this tube often will fit right in there, so it's out of the way. Now, once again, we already sanitized the lid, but since it's been sitting out, there's no harm in throwing it back in the star sand a little bit. Gonna put our lid back on. There you go, we've racked. Now, since this is a keg, we want to purge whatever oxygen is in there. So I'm just gonna grab a CO2 line, run that over here, make sure I've got the end. So it should be purged of its oxygen, and it's ready. And it's ready for carving. So that's it, that's how you rack. It's really pretty simple, as long as you keep things clean and sanitized, prevent oxygen uptake, and maximize the amount of beer you can get out of your batches.